Hello, I'm Stefan Petzold. I'm a lecturer in modern European history at the University of Leeds. My main specialism is on 20th century German history, and today I'll be talking about German history during the Third Reich. And it's really one of the most fascinating questions that historians have dealt with, is how the German population related to the Nazi regime, related to the Third Reich. And one of the related questions is why the Third Reich managed to stay in power for such a long time, for 12 years, and how and why the Nazis managed to consolidate their power, and why did so many ordinary Germans appear to accept, in one way or another, Nazi rule. And some of the related questions here are, did the Nazis succeed in subjugating German society to their will? Were Germans forced by the Nazi terror apparatus into acceptance? Were they brainwashed, perhaps, by Nazi propaganda? Or, and this is the other side of the argument, if you like, was the Nazi regime what a majority of Germans actually wanted in the 1930s? Was the legitimacy of the Third Reich based on widespread approval by many Germans? And I'll be discussing these questions in the course of this series of podcasts. And a useful concept to understanding Nazi society, I think, is that of the Volksgemeinschaft, or the people's community. What is this people's community? The notion of the people's community described the desire by many Germans to overcome the political and social divisions of the early 20th century. These divisions were the result of the industrialization process, which had radically changed the face of society and politics in Germany, but also in many other countries. And in the place of a divided and conflict-ridden society, many Germans wanted to create a coherent community that was based on unity and solidarity. It's important to note, however, that the people's community was not a Nazi invention. It had been around since at least the First World War and had been used frequently throughout the 1920s by many German political parties. But what the Nazis did, and what they added to the term of the people's community, was that they regarded it as a community that was defined mainly, if not exclusively, by race. And in their view, the people's community was a racially coherent community. At the same time, this idea of the people's community was a propaganda term used heavily by the Nazi regime, and this is very much why its usefulness for our understanding is problematic, because there is a certain danger here that we just take Nazi terms for granted and see them as a true reflection of reality. And it is very clear that German society was too diverse to neatly fit into the idea of a fully coherent and united people's community. But, and this is why I think the concept has some value to explaining what went on in German society, it was very much the promise and the ideal of a closely knit people's community that allowed for the mobilization of many people for the Nazi cause. So in other words, the people's community as such perhaps never really existed, but the widespread desire to create and achieve it was of real political significance. So what I'm going to do in this podcast is look at how the Nazis tried to establish and accomplish the people's community. And there were two main processes at work here, both of which complemented one another. And in fact, there were two sides of the same coin. First, there were clear boundaries drawn between those who belonged to the people's community and those who did not belong to the community. But not only were such outsiders identified, they were also gradually removed from German society. And the second of these complementary processes was that there were a number of measures to integrate those within the people's community or within German society into the community. And the ultimate aim was to create an image and ideally a reality of a society that was based on racial rather than class distinctions. Okay, so what we'll be talking about now is the first of these two complementary processes, exclusion. Exclusion was based off the definition of an alien other, the definition of certain social groups that lived in a country and were seen as aliens, as outsiders, as not belonging to the community. And it was very much to focus on excluding undesired parts of German society. There were three groups, broadly three groups of others that were excluded and persecuted in the Third Reich. First, there was the political other. These were communists and social democrats, and leading figures of both these parties were the first victims of Nazi repression. The second group of others was the, if you like, the social other, people with deviant lifestyles. In this group belong criminals, homosexuals, prostitutes, work-shy, homeless people, and beggars. And they were, or the Nazis tried to remove these from German society as part of a move to re-establish order and social purity, in order to really highlight the people's community as a closely knit community that was defined by a set of moral rules. Many of these social others, of these social aliens, were regarded as degenerate groups that were not part of and therefore had to be purged from the morally pure German people's community. And the third group, and perhaps the most well-known, the racial other. And this group very soon, certainly after 1934, 1935, became the main focus of exclusion and persecution. The exclusion of the racial other was very much influenced by ideas of scientific racism and the eugenics movement of the earlier 20th century. And they were very much seen, these groups, as threats to the racial purity of the German people. These were predominantly Jews, but there were also gypsies and later Eastern Europeans that were seen as being racial others, racial outsiders. But this group also included the mentally ill, who were seen not only as genetically inferior, but also as a danger to the health and the purity of the German race. But it was not just about the identification of these others, of those who did not belong to or were not supposed to belong to the German people's community, but their forceful removal from German society. And thus we have a second element, not just the identification of others, but the role of state terror, persecution, and repression. The Nazi police state very much provided the institutional framework through which exclusion was enforced and maintained. As early as 1933, the Nazi leadership established concentration camps across Germany that were seen by the Nazi leadership as institutions of betterment for mainly communists, at least initially communists and social democrats. These political deviants were subjected to surveillance, control, and forced labor in the camps, but many were released after a couple of years once they were deemed fit for reintegration into the people's community. Similarly, social deviants that I mentioned earlier, the second group of others, were imprisoned and or put in concentration camps. There were measures to exclude the hereditary ill through forced sterilizations in the course of the 1930s and through a euthanasia campaign that began in 1939. And as a result of this euthanasia campaign, about 70,000 mentally ill were killed. Jews were gradually and with increased intensity excluded from German society. This happened very early on, from 1933 onwards, through a set of legal measures, discrimination, and the use of violence. It was, however, not only achieved through state-sponsored repression and persecution, but also through the day-to-day actions of ordinary Germans. But repression through the police state also had to play a role not only for those outside of the ideal people's community, but for those on the inside of the community. So it was not only used to exclude so-called undesirable elements that were regarded as dangers to the health of the German race, but there was also an aim to ensure conformity within the people's community. For a long time, historians highlighted the impact of the terror system, of the Nazi terror system, on the German population and how it produced large-scale fear among them as the main form of control and coercion. So it's very much now that we're turning to those and the integration of the people within the people's community rather than exclusion. But this argument or this idea, this approach to mainly focus on the Nazi terror system and how it produced fear has become less convincing for a number of reasons. And these arguments against the role of terror and fear don't really make the claim that terror didn't exist or that it wasn't important. It was, of course, very important. But to understand what went on in Nazi Germany and to explain the relative stability and the popularity of the Nazi regime, in particular in the 1930s, in order to explain this, coercion and fear clearly aren't enough. And much recent research actually indicates that the Nazi vision of the people's community was quite an attractive one for many Germans. Germans were not necessarily forced to adopt Nazi ideology due to fear of repression and terror. Similarly, exclusion helped perhaps justify certain measures, and exclusion was central to the Nazi effort to create the people's community. But despite the exclusion of many social groups, the Nazis had to do more to rule effectively. They had to offer something positive to the German people. And the argument very much now is that Germans adopted Nazi ideology, if you like, became Nazis in the course of the 1930s, because they saw the benefits of what the Nazis had promised. And there may be more on this in the second part of the series, but I will now turn and look at the more inclusive steps taken by the Nazi regime, the positive vision that they tried to sell to Germans. The main objective here was to improve and increase the bonds of cohesion and solidarity between Germans. It should be promoted by eradicating social differences within the community. The idea of the people's community was one in which class hierarchies did not exist. And the idea was very much there to highlight the absence of class hierarchies in order to play up the racial differences. And this is where really integration and exclusion related to one another. So integration into the people's community was mainly attempted through allowing Germans to experience the people's community and seeing the positive effects of being a worthy part of the community. A part here was played by state propaganda. As early as March 1933, the Reich Ministry of Propaganda was established with Joseph Goebbels at its head. The ministry aimed to control the mass media as well as high and popular culture. And one of the key propaganda innovations, perhaps, in Nazi Germany was the distribution of cheap radios so that many people could be reached through or by Nazi propaganda. The Nazi regime, however, also recognized the immense value of the cinema and the use that it would have for Nazi propaganda. But even though films with a clear propagandist intent existed and were often used as main examples for propaganda, perhaps they did not play quite as big a role as is sometimes given. Far more important here were films for entertainment. They allowed disseminating a message of Nazi ideology in much subtler and thus more effective ways. And it was more effective precisely because it did not appear as propaganda. Equally, and perhaps more important, was, however, not the dissemination of ideas through state propaganda, but it was the experience of the people's community in action. Many of these inclusive measures focused on a direct experience of the community. By taking part in such community-based activities, Germans would have a direct personal and practical connection with the community, and would feel this and thereby making it part of their own lives. There were a number of state organizations and activities that promoted the experience of the community. One example here were the youth organizations such as the Hitler Youth, which aimed at socializing young people into the community through community-based activities. Another way how Germans were encouraged to experience the people's community firsthand were various welfare and charity organizations. The Nazis promoted, for example, participation in winter aid collections, or the People's Welfare Organization, through which Germans were to make sacrifices for the community and thereby experiencing what they give to the community and what they can deliver for that community. Another element in relation to welfare was the promotion of so-called one-pot meals on Sundays. By taking part in this scheme, Germans were imagining the wider people's community. Hitler very often was portrayed as participating in these events, which highlighted the idea of the community in which differences did not exist and in which any distinction between ruling and the ruled was eradicated. One other key program was Strength Through Joy, which organized social and sports activities and focused in particular on tourism, and these tourist activities are perhaps the main focus of research on Strength Through Joy. As part of this Strength Through Joy program, which was associated with the Ministry of Labour, a number of holiday resorts were constructed in or by the sea and in mountainous areas, and they organized cruise ship holidays to Scandinavia or the Mediterranean. And through these holiday activities, but also other group-based collective activities, what the Nazis tried to achieve was an integration of leisure activities into a Nazi framework of society, and by doing so creating an ideal people's community in which class distinctions did not exist. But Strength Through Joy is also important because it tells us something about the importance of consumption, and in particular the importance of consumption for the success, or for explaining the success of the Nazi regime. So the Nazis sought to implement the idea of the people's community in a number of ways. Their main objective was to create the image of a united and cohesive community in which social differences did not exist. This was the main focus of integrative and inclusive measures that I've just outlined, but at the same time, Germans were supposed to imagine their difference not in social terms, but in racial ones. And this is why exclusion, largely based on racism, was so important. It was the other side of the creation of the people's community. So conflict was not supposed to exist within the people's community, not between social classes, but between races.